Hey guys, Richard at the range. Just wanted to come back with a tip of the week. And last time we sort of talked about sight alignment, sight picture, and things like that, part of this process of shooting. One of the most critical phases of shooting has to do with the trigger pull. You know, we're standing there, we're holding the gun correctly, we line the sights up, and then we pull the trigger. And a lot of problems we see with our students stem from incorrect trigger pull or incorrect trigger placement. So just to cover that briefly today, when we're going to fire the gun, when we put our finger on the trigger, it doesn't go just on the tip of the finger. It doesn't go up to or past that first knuckle. We're going to start right in the middle of that first pad. I want to feel good contact with the trigger right in the middle of that first pad. And we're going to maintain good contact with the trigger through the trigger pull. Once we have established a good finger placement on the trigger, we need to pull the trigger correctly. And I have the world's most perfect graph that covers how to properly pull the trigger. Pressure, time, when we're actually concentrating on the front sight. We talked about that the other day. And this graph is just amazing. Unfortunately for me, and probably for most of you, it's largely unintelligible. I can't look at that and easily determine what I should be doing with my trigger pull. So let's think about it a different way. One of the examples I use most often is, have you ever driven through a parking lot and not seen the speed bump? If you think about that, what happens when you hit that speed bump without ever noticing it? You get a bunch of unintended movement. And that's what happens with our trigger pull. Yes, we want to develop a nice, smooth pull to the rear. As we practice, it's going to become one movement. But what I want to do is kind of break the trigger pull down into a couple of segments. And if we're talking about semi-automatics, most often there's a little bit of free play in that trigger. We got our finger in the right place, and it takes 0 pounds of pressure to move that trigger back to a certain point at which the trigger stops. And that's the point here where we say prep and reset point. If the trigger's fully released and we start to pull to the rear, there's no resistance, and then we hit that speed bump. The trigger stops, or we feel pressure building on the trigger. At that point, we really need to focus on that front sight and think about nice, smooth, controlled pressure on the trigger to the rear until the gun goes off. Once the gun goes off, we're going to maintain pressure on that trigger until we realign our sights, and then we're going to come back to that reset point, and we're physically going to feel the trigger reset itself. There's also an audible click with a lot of firearms. So we're kind of breaking the trigger pull down into separate steps, and as we get accustomed to that, we'll be able to pull the trigger smoothly. But until we know what each of those feels like, I think it's beneficial to break it down. We're going to prep the trigger. We're going to press the trigger or squeeze the trigger to the rear. We're going to keep that trigger pulled through, recoil, and then we're going to come back on target and reset that trigger. Those are the elements of a good trigger pull. For beginning shooters, we need to break those down into individual steps and really focus on feeling those out in the range, which is where we're going to head next. Hey guys, we're still here at ProShots. We just transitioned from the classroom to the range. We saw the wonderful graph and the wonderful picture, but I want to see these trigger pulls in real life and kind of what we're talking about and how the trigger works. So we've got a revolver and a semi-automatic, and I just want to look at this trigger function, and then we'll try some live rounds to do the shooting. So again, we're going to start with an unloaded gun. And I just want you to see the different stages. Remember, we talked about the slack in the trigger. There's a certain amount of movement that does nothing, and then we kind of hit that little wall. That's the point at which with this gun it's going to take about 4 pounds of pressure, maybe 5 pounds of pressure to actually discharge the firearm. And we hear the firearm click. Now notice that the finger is still in contact with the trigger. We're right in the middle of that first pad. If we were using ammo, the gun would cycle, and then I would reset the trigger. All that means is we just slowly let forward, and we hear that click, and we kind of feel it in the fingertip too. There may be a little bit of take up, but I'm right against that 4 pounds of pressure. All I have to do is make sure those sights are on target, slow, steady pressure on the trigger until the gun goes off. So that's with a semi-automatic. I think we're going to try it with some live rounds here. I'm going to shoot one-handed so you can see what the finger's doing as I shoot. So we have a loaded gun now. We're pointed downrange at the target. I'm focused on the front sight, finger right on the middle of that first pad, and I'm just slowly going to apply pressure now that I've prepped that trigger until the gun goes off. And notice my finger through all that recoil is still in contact with the trigger. Now if we listen for the click, I'm going to feel it in the trigger. There's the reset, a little bit of take up. I'm going to focus on that front sight, just slow step pressure until the gun goes off. All right, I think most shooters are conditioned to let go of the trigger after they pull it. So you may inadvertently shoot a double tap while you're attempting this. That's okay if the gun is pointed at the target when that second round goes off. Obviously we don't want to do that unless we intend to shoot a double tap or a controlled trigger. But that's 4 controlled shots. The finger never left the trigger. Once we're done shooting, then we can place that finger on the frame where it belongs. So this was a striker fired gun. Most semi-automatics are going to have a trigger similar to that. Revolver is where it all kind of goes sideways. Again, empty gun. This is obviously a double action only revolver. I don't have a hammer. And so with these types of pistols, it's okay to slide that finger in a little bit more because you need a little extra strength when you're pulling that 10-pound trigger pull to get that trigger all the way to the rear. If you pull a revolver trigger slowly enough, you can actually stage the shot as well, right there. Now, as I just finished squeezing that trigger, all that fell was the hammer. So I would say the double action trigger pull is actually harder to master than the single action trigger pull, but let's see what that looks like with some live ammo. We love revolvers, but they take longer to load than that semi-automatic, right? And I'm not Jerry Micklin, so don't expect greatness. A lot of practice required with this. So I've got my good one-handed grip. Again, I'm focused on that front sight. I'm just slowly going to pull that trigger all the way through that action. I get staged, and then the shot breaks. Again, I'm resetting that trigger, but my finger's not making contact with the trigger. It's a longer reset because there's more travel to this trigger. So I have to come all the way forward, but I'm still maintaining that same position on the trigger with that finger, and eliminating that variable from my shooting. We get our 5 shots. If you're anticipating with any pistol, if you're shooting a revolver and you get that click, if you're anticipating, you'll see that barrel drop. That's our tip of the week from ProShots here. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you at the range, and hope that you like these tips. But y'all have a great week. We'll see you next week.